I'm here with Morley Winograd, who's an author, a national political advisor, and an expert on the millennial generation. He's the author of 3 books with Michael Hayes on the millennial generation, including the latest, which is Millennial Majority, How a New Coalition is Remaking American Politics. He's been chairman of the Democratic Party of Michigan, was a senior policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore, director of the National Partnership for Reinventing Government, and he's currently the president of the Campaign for Free College Tuition, which is a nonprofit dedicated to reforming the financing of America's public education. We've been talking in an earlier segment about the millennial generation and their impact on politics now and in the future. It's going to be growing. It's an optimistic generation, as Morley has written about. We talked a little bit in the last segment about the relative advantage that the Democrats have with the millennial generation because they tend to be socially progressive, civically involved. I wonder, what about the future of, what about the partisanship and the gridlock in Washington? I mean, obviously everybody's upset about that. It's not just the millennials, but I think that in your books you've suggested that the millennials are the ones who are going to resolve this issue once and for all. Right. So my question, I guess, is how are they going to do that and when are they going to do that?
Yeah, and how soon can they get them there, right?
How soon can we get them there?
Yeah, and I think we have, unfortunately, at least 4 more, if not 15 more years of before the thing transforms itself. But by the end of this decade, millennials will be more than 1 out of every 3 eligible voters in America. They're not going to put up with the kind of things that are going on in Washington now, and they're going to look for different people and different ideas. The single greatest generational turnover in Congress occurred several years after the Civil War, the last time we had this kind of gridlock, which was unresolvable. Yeah. And then after the war, the nation sort of said, enough, let's move on and get something done. Yeah. And we had a complete generational shift in terms of numbers of older versus younger generations. It could be that dramatic in this particular case. More likely, what we're going to see is an increasing number of younger people running for political office, getting elected by an electorate tired of the performance of those in power. And that may take from now till 2025, maybe worst case 2030. But it is absolutely going to happen. Millennials are not a confrontational generation. They're the exact opposite from boomers in that kind of personality trait. They're very nice people who like to figure out how to create win-win solutions. They will when they're in power. We just need to get them into power. Yeah. Well, I wonder how deep is the surgery going to go? You know, because obviously on some of the social issues we can see the progress already. Yes. But in terms of the systemic issues, in terms of the political parties, for example, you have a lot of dysfunction there, and part of it is based on the money in politics, on the pressure to be fundraising and running for re-election constantly, and you have a pretty sort of stultified political party system now, I'd say. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's corrupt, but it's certainly, there are very few incentives for change. So how deep do you go, does the millennial generation go into systemic change? I think it goes very deep. I think today we have a political system built around big money from small number of people, a couple hundred people actually, in order to buy television ads, talk to everybody else. And millennials don't watch television. The whole notion of broadcast media driving American politics will become as old-fashioned and out of date as the notion that broadcast media drives our entertainment culture today. And you know, all the popular video programming is not on broadcast network television. And social media allows you to produce it on your own. And all of that is going to be the way millennials conduct politics. And the older folks may not hear about it until it's over, and they may be surprised about it, a la the Romney campaign in 2012. Gee, where'd all those voters come from? We were taking polls and it didn't look that way. But that's how it'll happen. It won't happen because the existing system is changed. It'll happen because the existing system is displaced. One of the things that I think about the progressive era in the late 19th century, there was a grassroots populist movement, and probably in part due to new generations and disruption of agricultural and agrarian.
And some of that populist movement turned into independent political parties, the People's Party, William Jennings Bryan, and those. And although they never really got anywhere on the national political scene, I think they did provide sort of an incentive for Teddy Roosevelt to initiate the reforms of the progressive era. Do you see a scenario like that where it happens outside the political parties in a populist sense, or do you see it more, let's reform the Democratic Party from within?
And the Republican Party.
And the Republican Party.
Well, first of all, part of that progressive change occurred through new media. They were called magazines and muckraking magazines, and that was a whole new media phenomenon. So I think we're already seeing the media set of changes that are necessary for the system to be overturned. Ultimately, because of the way the American political system is constructed, the reform has to come to a point where one or both parties need to embrace it. As you pointed out, Teddy Roosevelt sort of took on some of that and ran a third-party candidacy, a very successful but ultimately not successful third-party candidacy, but it enabled Woodrow Wilson and FDR after him to pick up that progressive mantle in a different party, the Democratic Party. Right. So I think you're going to see insurgents, whether they're inside the party, you know, like today people would point to an Elizabeth Warren on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, you might point to some of the Tea Party enthusiasts as the insurgency there. You'll see those kinds of things that political parties, in order to maintain power, will need to figure out how to deal with. But it's not always the same political party, and it's not always the same political attitude. It's rather has to be molded into a form that's acceptable to the majority.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about the FDR coalition and the New Deal coalition, and in fact, looking back on that, that was a shifting coalition. There were Dixiecrats, and then there were a bunch of other people, so the coalition kind of reformed constantly.
Yeah, what happens, and we write about this quite a bit in Millennial Makeover and repeat ourselves a bit, and an I Told You So book on millennial majority, but what happens is it isn't because new coalitions get formed not because a whole bunch of people change their mind, although in the FDR coalition, certainly African-American constituency moved from the Republican Party and loyalty to Lincoln to a support of FDR despite the Southern Democratic resistance to integration. But for the most part, it happens because a new generation, not wedded to the existing coalitions, enters the electorate in sufficient force to realign the power structure. And it was the GI generation in FDR's days. It will be the millennial generation in this environment. And it was Generation X and to some degree boomers that gave us a Republican-dominated national scene for many years.
So the trajectory you're looking at 15, 20 years out, with millennials, with the Democrats having an advantage, does that look like a more permanent Democratic majority?
Well, it's permanent as long as anything can be permanent in an era of generational change. We think it'll last decades. It's actually already here. As we write about in Millennial Majority, the outcomes of the 2008 and 2012 elections were predictable if you looked at generations and demographics. And the demographic danger that the Republican Party faces, which we write about and talk about how they might deal with it, is that they're not part of that emerging demographic shift. Hispanics, traditional minorities, Asian Americans, and this younger generation, plus the enormously larger number of single women, all form a coalition that elected President Obama. In 2012, he would not have been reelected if the voting age was 30 and up. Yeah. He lost that electorate.
Yep. So turning to the immediate future, the election of 2016, it's a baby boom election in terms of the candidates that we're looking at. Hillary Clinton is by far the front runner among Democrats, and Jeb Bush has declared. Mitt Romney has declared. I guess I would want to put some money down on Jeb Bush. What's your sense of the millennial?
Well, I would think that from a millennial perspective, there's a lot of interest on the Republican side with Rand Paul, because he's trying to take a more moderate position on a few social issues. Not all of them. He takes no moderate position at all on the issue of choice and abortion. But in terms of marijuana legalization and gender equality, he's more appealing amongst the Republican candidates to millennials. On the other hand, millennials are still looking for the right Democrat. That generation's attitudes are not traditional liberal attitudes. They are tolerant, and on social issues, they sound so liberal that people call them liberals. On economics, they're as anti-bureaucratic as any other Republican. They're not interested in big government. They're not interested in big government programs. They're interested in things getting done quickly and efficiently with technology. It's a Democrat who figures out how to, harness the desire for collective action, using government as an instrument to change the world for the better, which is what millennials want to do.
Well, do you think the millennials,
without building big new bureaucratic systems?
Yeah, I mean, in that regard, do you think millennials are actually more in the traditional mainstream of American politics, where people are socially progressive but economically or fiscally more conservative?
Yes. Well, actually, they're in an even grander political American tradition, because it goes back to the initial dilemma between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution.
Right.
How are we going to have a strong, effective, collective power and yet preserve individual freedom and liberty? And the Republican generation, its civic generation of its day, figured out an answer to that in the Constitution, which resolved some of the difficulties with total decentralization and all liberty that the Articles of Confederation presented, and instead figured out a way that you could have both intertwined. And that is the unique nature of American DNA. And that combination worked until it broke down over the issue of slavery. It worked again until it broke down over the issue of the industrial age economics. And FDR had to create 4 freedoms that had to do with economic security as opposed to political liberty. And we're looking for that formulation today.
Do you think in the 2016 election, you talked about the certain appeal of a Rand Paul. There's also the Marco Rubios, who are of a younger generation.
Well, and Jeb Bush's Latina wife and a different Hispanic attitude.
How does that pull millennials in or out?
Well, again, a lot of it depends upon whether the Republicans want to get past the initial screen of social issues. And so far they have indicated, at least from a nominating process, no interest in dealing with those social issues in ways that attract millennials. So millennials never hear the rest of their message. It's kind of like, well, I didn't hear what you had to say about things I really care about. Now you're talking about stuff I don't totally understand. I'm not even going to listen to you. Yeah, and the Democrats have the opposite problem. They've got an audience. They haven't spoken to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of we always talk about the Democrats circling the wagons and shooting in, and it seems like this is what's happening with the Republicans now.
Well, it's a complete reversal. We talk a bit about that in Millennial Majority, that the status and situation of the two parties has flip-flopped.
Well, in terms of message, and we want to get off the 2016 in a minute, but Hillary Clinton, I mean, to me, that's a big question about messaging and mission, purpose, goals. What's the vision?
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think I don't have any inside knowledge of the Hillary Clinton campaign and its policy work. I think it's the critical question for her campaign. Is it Obama 3, a third term? Is it Bill Clinton reincarnated? Or is it something new and different that deals directly with today's challenges of economic mobility and middle-class wage stagnation? And how do you go about doing that? We happen to think that addressing the challenge of financing higher education is central to answering that question. It'd be interesting to see what she says about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that issue, plus a number of other bread and butter issues, are what people are really looking for, whatever generation you're in.
And you don't hear the Congress even talking about them.
No.
They're off talking about things that are completely unrelated to the problems that Americans talk about at their kitchen table.
Right. We're desperate for leadership on that. It's interesting, if Jeb Bush is the nominee and Hillary Clinton, I think there's an interesting discussion there. Both people seem to be more focused on that, on some of the bread and butter stuff, if provided the Republican gets through the hurdles of the primary.
Yeah, again, economic versus social issues. In eras where civic generations are predominant, the country's politics are about economics. In issues where generations like boomers, ideologically oriented generations, transcendentalists before them, are the majority of the electorate, social issues are the issue. Prohibition, teaching of evolution.
Right.
Those were the things that consumed an earlier generation, right? Those are rapidly fading to the background, but unfortunately, the elected officials are behind the change as opposed to ahead of the change.
Gotcha. You know, in terms of the college funding we've talked about, I mean, you're right, sort of dead center on the confluence, I think, of a number of issues. One is the bread and butter issues, the issue of economic equality, but also the importance of education to developing human capital for economic competitiveness in the future for America.
Right.
So you're part of an effort, and I know you've started efforts to provide free tuition in community colleges, and this has been now endorsed by the president, who's made that proposal. So talk about the gestation of that.
So in our second book, Millennial Momentum, we wrote a chapter on higher education as we went through the institutions that will be greatly impacted by the millennial generation. And in the course of that, we read about the people in Kalamazoo, Michigan, who started something with the help of philanthropists, still anonymous to this day, from their city, that promised high school students that they wouldn't have to pay college tuition if they graduated from Kalamazoo's public schools with good grades and got accepted. And it had a startling impact on their K-12 education process. They get significant improvements, statistically significant improvements in grade point average, high school graduation rates, college enrollment. And so a number of cities across the country have started these promise programs, and we wrote in the book, someday Kalamazoo's promise will be America's promise. And that's how we got started. How would you go about doing that? And we have a plan on how you could do that today without raising any taxes or doing anything else. It's on our website, freecollegenow.org, and it involves providing scholarships equivalent to the cost of a public university's in-state residence tuition. The president has proposed a step towards that goal, a wonderful step towards that goal, which is let's do it at the community college level first, and we're extraordinarily excited about that.
Yeah, and this is not a new idea. I mean, Tennessee Promise has got a program in place that does this in a number of statewide, actually.
It does. Tennessee is the first place to take the idea of promise programs to a state level. It's not coincidental that the governor of Tennessee, who's a Republican, was the mayor of Knoxville, which had a Knoxville Promise program called Knox Achieves. And it's there where the mayor learned about the impact of this program. When he became governor, that idea had spread through a lot of places in Tennessee. And so it was not that difficult to convince the legislature that we might as well do this statewide. It's very interesting, his focus, which is true, it increases educational opportunity, but it's located in the economic development part of government. It's part of their, what they call Drive to 55, getting a majority of their workforce to have a college education. That's how it ties back to the issues we've been talking about. Economic challenges, global competitiveness, wage stagnation on the part of middle class. You can break through those if we can break through the bottleneck of getting people the skills and training they need to be successful in today's economy.
Yeah, and you know, my experience in the world of community college is that it's such a critical link between high school graduation and a vocation, because what community colleges do better than anybody is train people for vocational work.
Correct.
You know, in every segment, you know, healthcare, which is growing.
And in fact, the drivers inside the White House deliberations about whether to go forward with this initiative was the Council of Economic Advisors, who kept pointing out the economic necessity of the program. Right. Forget its political benefits or its educational opportunity benefits. It is an economic necessity.
And obviously, the private industry is all behind this kind of, because they're looking for workers.
Well, yes, they should be. We'll see how they react to it is a bipartisan program. The governor of Tennessee was with the president when it was announced, and we have a bipartisan leadership in our own nonprofit. That hasn't been hard to do. We'll see once you put it into that cauldron of hatred and partisanship in the Congress, whether business will stand up to their Republican allies and say you have to do this.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about the politics in a second, but in terms of the funding, Obama's proposal is to provide 75% federal funding, and the rest would be handled by states. But this is really a reallocation of funds from other sources.
We haven't seen the pay for yet in terms of, he hasn't written or spoken, maybe he will in the State of the Union, to where he's going to get the money. What we pointed out in our program was that the federal government spends hundreds of billions of dollars in support of higher education today. And if you just took the dollars being spent on tuition tax credits, on Pell Grants and so forth, and said, let's put all that together in a scholarship pool and send everybody a check for their tuition, you'd have enough money to pay for it without doing anything else.
Right.
I don't know that's where the president's going. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, one of the ways that cuts politically, I suppose, is that there are winners and losers in the proposal. Public institutions benefit to some degree, or to a great degree.
Great degree.
Private and some of the for-profit, the Phoenix universities and these places, may not benefit because fewer Pell Grants or loans.
Well, the challenge wouldn't be so much in the Pell Grant area as the fact that the value proposition is you can go there for free or here for thousands of dollars. That's a tough value proposition for for-profits to sell. In the state of Tennessee, there was a battle, one of the few battles in the legislature was from the four-year colleges, which were worried that they were going to drain students away into the community college system, and it probably will. But four-year colleges can get very good at teaching juniors and seniors under this proposal.
Yeah. Well, so then let's talk about the politics of it a little bit. At this point, it's a proposal. We don't have a bill. We don't really know what the devil details are. What's your prognosis on that one?
Well, I think I'm very heartened by the fact that Senator Alexander from Tennessee, and his compatriot, Senator Corker, but most importantly, Senator Alexander, a Republican who's chairman of the new Senate Education Committee, journeyed to Tennessee to talk with the president on the way down on Air Force One about all this. He has his goals, which are simplifying financial aid application, a notable and certainly worthwhile goal. The president explained his goal, and they didn't leave Tennessee mad. They left Tennessee talking, and so as long as they're talking, it's a possibility.
One of the things that we're facing in California is a little bit different because this proposal might impact us differently than some of the other states.
Well, first of all, California has the cheapest, even though everybody complains about it, community colleges in the country.
Right.
And so actually California is in a position where if it wanted to, it could make its community colleges tuition-free tomorrow with very, very little money. Our challenges here are how can we then deal properly with the burgeoning population and their CSU and UC attendance. And the legislature's done a lot of good things. The new Secretary of State, when he was State Senator, Alex Padilla, did a great deal to make sure you could transfer easily and efficiently and in a frictionless way from community colleges to four-year colleges. Don't forget, under the President's program, which he's adopted that California idea, you effectively have cut the cost of four-year college in half as well if you care to go that route. So our challenges are a little bit different. I'm absolutely sure California would be supportive if offered the opportunity to make their community colleges free.
Just on a note there, if I'm a community college, I'm at PCC, Pasadena Community College, and I'm paying low tuition, but I'm paying a lot of money on books and expenses or transportation, things like that. Can you help me out with that in this program?
The President's proposal actually does help. It's what we call a first dollar scholarship or first dollar program, in the sense that the President said, we'll pay the tuition. We're not getting rid of Pell Grants. So if you get a Pell Grant, or in California, if you get a Cal Grant, or in California, a number of other opportunities there, if you get those kinds of scholarships, feel free to spend them as you need them for textbooks and transportation. Living expenses are a little more of a personal decision. Do you live on campus? Do you live off campus? Do you commute? All that sort of thing. But that's all sitting there. So it would be of enormous benefit in addressing that. Plus, there's a big movement on the technology side, going back to the millennial world, to make textbooks electronically available for free. And those kinds of open resources would also significantly cut the cost of college.
Yeah, we have a showdown looming. It already exists between Governor Brown and the Chancellor or the President of the University of California over tuition. I mean, I know there's been a lot of activism on campuses among students about this. Do you have a view on that?
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually think UC tuition should be free. That's what it was in 1975. That's what it was under the master plan. That's what it can be again with any kind of leadership. I'm very disappointed in the suggestions from Napolitano, the head of the UC system, that she sees no way to avoid 5% tuition increases. If you were a CEO of a company and you came to your board and said, look, we can't find any productivity gains. We're just going to have to raise prices 5% every year whether our customers can afford it or not, they'd fire you the next day.
Yeah.
And I think Governor Brown is right in taking her on, and I don't think her proposal will survive.
Yeah, I mean, on a sense, perhaps they've fallen into the trap of competing with the private universities in terms of
Well, they say that's the reason, but if you look at their actual expenditures, it's on a lot of things besides faculty salaries that we don't necessarily need in order to be effectively educated.
Yeah. Well, let me pull back a little bit on the millennials again in this education issue, because to me, one of the themes that we've talked about is the pressures of globalization and technology change, and America as a society being prepared for this. And education is obviously a very important one. Immigration reform is also important. Are these things that you think millennials have an instinctive feel for that kind of change?
Well, certainly on the immigration side, 1 out of 5 millennials are the children of immigrant parents. So when people are hostile to immigrants, they're talking badly about their parents.
Yeah.
Unlike older generations, millennials love their parents. So that's not a good way to approach their feelings. Second of all, 40% of millennials are non-white. A lot of that is Hispanic millennials over and above the Asian Americans who all have immigrant stories in their families and are very concerned about making sure that they get a chance to participate fully in American life. Then you forget all that, and you just go to the general attitude of millennials, which is very inclusive, very tolerant, very interested in having everybody in the group succeed. And so they're a strongly pro-immigration reform part of the electorate, and one of the reasons the Republicans are having so much difficulty with them as a constituency is their hostility.
Also, I would say, and I know you've stressed this, that the networking aspect of millennial life is a driver for this kind of global understanding.
Sharing is what millennials do. Now we're all sharing photos and God knows what. But if it's shareable, millennials will share it. And if it isn't, they'll want to know why they can't. And that sharing is not limited as it used to be geographically or to a physical place. It's obviously available globally to the degree some of societies in the globe don't want to participate, maybe not, but for the most societies, this is what millennials like to do, and also that leads to a lot more understanding of other cultures.
Yeah, it also bumps up against our traditional capitalist system. I mean, it's kind of the transition from industrial age to information age,
Absolutely.
Or from agrarian to industrial.
Absolutely, and the shift from industrial age to information age is why we can't live with an educational system built on industrial age skills, which is high school diplomas. We have to have one built on information age skills, which is a college diploma, and it shouldn't cost you any more for tuition than going to high school.
And it may be a community college diploma, it may be an AA, it may be a
It may
BA.
not be 4 years, but it should be something.
Right, right. Well, I would say I'm optimistic now.
Good. I never was more optimistic than when we were writing our books about millennials.
Yeah. Well, I have a son who's a millennial, and I absolutely see mirrored in him the points that you've made. And for a baby boomer like me and like you,
oh no, I'm older than that.
Oh, all right. Well,
I belong to the generation before boomers.
You may be fortunate in that way. So thank you again, Morley Winograd. It's been a pleasure to have you and so enlightening.
It's been a joy to talk to you. Thanks.